We are going to look at one of, I would suggest, probably the most familiar stories in Scripture, the story of David and Goliath. And what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to pull out some principles regarding planning. How many of you have ever stepped out in faith to do something that you believed that God had called you to do, and you said, I'm going to do this, and it did not go well? All right, I'm in good company. I've had that happen a number of times where I thought, I'm pretty sure this is what God is telling me to do. I'm trusting in faith that he's going to bless it, and it did not go well. What I'm going to do this morning is we're going to look at David's decision to take on Goliath. And what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to give you what I think are 3 questions that you can ask as you're about to take a dangerous or maybe we would say a risky step of faith. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack these principles, and they're in the story of David, which I'm going to tell you that story. And then at the end, I want to deal with our hearts on the topic of faith, and I'll kind of wrap up there. My hope is to restore some confidence. But the other thing is, if you're here and you're like my age or older, I'm guessing, and I mentioned this in my preview that I sent out this week, I'm guessing you've had conversations with young people who have had really big ideas or big plans, sort of audacious plans that they were going to embark on by faith, and you found yourself struggling with, do I tell them this is a stupid idea, or do I just smile and say, God bless you and have fun? How many of you have ever been in that position, wrestled with that conversation? You have, right? What I want to do for you is to equip you with some questions that you can direct towards those conversations. I've been in a number of those conversations, and like I said in my preview earlier this week, I would not say that all of those conversations have gone well. I have left some of those conversations feeling like maybe I was overly critical. I have left some of those conversations feeling like maybe I should have said more and stopped what they were about to do. But what I want to do is give you some questions that you can direct, and this is from the story of David, that you can direct towards that person, ask them these questions so that they can evaluate whether or not this faith decision, this ridiculous, crazy idea that they have is something that they should pursue, and let them sort through it before the Lord. I'm trying to keep this mic off of my hairy face, but it's still a little bit scratchy. Let's give it up for Scott Fraley. Proverbs 15:22, without consultation, plans are frustrated, but with many counselors, they succeed. And yet the challenge that I have run into is that I have had counselors give me opposite advice. You guys run into that? I seek out the counsel of others, and one says absolutely, and another one says absolutely no. That's what I want to navigate this morning. So here's our story. David has just been anointed the new king of Israel. If you haven't been with us the last few weeks, we've been talking through the story of Saul. Saul's time of blessing from the Lord as king was very short-lived. He made some real critical mistakes and then followed up those mistakes with what I would call responsive mistakes. In other words, rather than correcting, he continued down his course and made matters worse. And so God has said, Saul is no longer going to be king. I'm going to find someone who is after my own heart. And David is anointed king. But this is not, we would assume at this point that this is not common knowledge. Samuel sneaks off to the house of Jesse. Jesse has 8 sons, and God selects the youngest son, David. Samuel anoints him king in a secret king anointing ceremony there in their home. Now we're into the next chapter. And Saul and the Philistines are going at it. This is, we have fishing season here in the summer. You guys are used to seasonal things. They had war in the summer. So they would go out during war season and set up their camps and then figure out, okay, what is this summer going to look like? Hopefully it's a good year. So Saul and his army are going out to meet the Philistines. And I'm just going to kind of talk you through this story. As soon as I find my text, we're in 1 Samuel 17. So the Philistines had gathered their armies for battle, so they're all ready to go. And Saul had gathered his army for battle, so they're all ready to go. And they're on opposite sides of this valley. And they drew up in battle array in order to take each other on. And they're on one side, Philistines are on one side, the Israelites on one side. And then what happens is normally they would say, okay, we're going to count to 3, and then everyone's going to go. And so we would 1, 2, 3, all right, everybody fight. And then, it's dinner time. Let's call it for today, and we'll be back at it tomorrow. We'll see you at 8 o'clock sharp. But the Philistines had a different idea this time. They said, hey, let's not exert all that effort. Let's make things easier. We'll send one guy down, and he'll face one of your guys, and whoever wins wins the whole lottery. And so they send this guy down named Goliath. And again, this is a fairly familiar story. Goliath was extremely tall, somewhere between like 9 and 10 feet tall. We know that when the Israelites first came into the Promised Land, there were giants in the land. So Goliath was likely a descendant of those guys. So there's this really big guy, and the Philistines send him out as their champion. It says that he was dressed in plated armor or scaled armor, this handcrafted armor that weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. So basically the armor that was over his torso weighed 80 pounds. He has helmet, he has armor covering his legs. It says that the tip of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, which is essentially the weight of a sledgehammer, like a 10-pound sledge. That's the tip of his spear. He has a shield carrier who walks out in front of him, just carrying his shield. And, of course, he has a sword. And it says that he stood and he would shout to the ranks of Israel. And he would say to them, hey, why come out in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you become our servants. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And then Saul and all of Israel heard this, heard the words of the Philistines. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. It's interesting. Saul essentially just accepts the terms of warfare, which is a whole nother sermon that I don't have time for today. But Saul says, okay, I guess that's what we're doing. So then the story kind of cuts off to a side story. It says that there's a man named Jesse, who we've just been introduced to, and he had 8 sons, and his 3 oldest sons were down joining the battle against the Philistines. Of course, not really a battle, but they're in the battle array. They're in the army. And so Jesse occasionally would send his youngest son, David, who took care of the sheep back at home. He would send them down with some supplies to give to his older brothers and then to bring home news to his father. So Jesse sends David down. He says, I want you to go. I want you to take these 10 loaves. I want you to take some roasted grain. Go down to the camp, take them this stuff, and then look into their welfare and bring me back some news. So David gathers up the supplies, and he heads down. It says he arose early in the morning. He left his sheep with someone else to caretake them, and he went down to the circle of the camp. And it says he went down there while the army was going out into battle array, shouting the war cry. So this would happen daily. These 2 armies would get all suited up, all ready to go, and they would get into their formations, and they would all start shouting at each other, and then Goliath would walk out, and they would all be quiet, and then they would all go home. This had been going on for over a month, for 40 days, it says. So David shows up at the camp right as this is happening. They're in formation, the battle cry, everyone's shouting, and Goliath comes out. It says, David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper, which is the first baggage claim in the scripture, and ran to the battle line and ran up to the battle line to meet his brothers. And as he was talking with them, he said, hey guys, can I yell with you just for a few minutes? This is fun. As they're there, the Philistine Goliath comes out and does his whole spiel, which he's been doing for 40 days at this point. And when all of the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. So again, this has been going on for 40 days. Battle formation, everyone, rah, rah, rah. Goliath walks out, and they all run back to their tents. So David is there, he's watching this, and there's some guys around him, and they say, hey, have you seen this guy? Have you been here? This is amazing. He's coming up to defy Israel in verse 25. And here's the deal. I don't know if you know this or if you've heard this, but whoever kills that guy, if that was possible, he's going to be wildly wealthy. Not only that, but King Saul is going to give him one of his daughters, making him a prince. Not only that, but he won't have to pay taxes the rest of his life. That alone would get me out on that battlefield, right? So David is fascinated by this, told him everything that would happen, and his older brothers catch on that David is having this conversation with the men around him. And it says now, Eliab, his older brother, heard David speaking to these men, asking these questions about what would happen for the man who defeated this giant. And Eliab's anger burned against David. And he said, why are you here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? It's a fantastic, older brother comment. What are you doing here, and who's tending to your pathetic responsibilities at home? And then he says, I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, which seems to escalate kind of quickly. I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. And David says, what have I done? I was just asking questions, which is not true. David is already concocting a plan in his mind. He's evaluating the situation. And before he has even taken one single step towards his plan, his older brother comes in and says, you need to get out of here. I know what you're thinking, and you're an ignorant fool. Go home and take care of the sheep. So David kind of backs away a little bit and goes to speak to someone else and says, tell me again what's going to happen to the guy who takes Goliath down. And they kept giving him the same answer. In fact, the passage says that he spoke to so many people that eventually within the camp, the rumor made it to Saul that there's this guy in the camp who keeps asking questions. And so Saul says, bring him to me. So David is brought to Saul, and it says that he said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're a kid, and he has been a warrior from his youth. So, here's the first question. I'm going to give you 3 questions to evaluate your risky faith decision as you contemplate stepping out in obedience. Here's the first question. Do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? Do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? David responds to Saul. David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. And when a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I would seize him by the beard, and I struck him and I killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them. So David essentially says, I kill carnivores with my bare hands. This guy will be no problem. Do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? I would suggest that walking in obedient faith will require of you character development, skill development, and faith development. That God's calling on your life is not in the absence of the qualities that he has invested in you that you must develop in order to be available for that plan. Even Jesus himself, I've always found this to be a fascinating story. When Jesus was 12 years old, he leaves his parents and enters the temple. His parents freak out. They spend several days looking for him. They find him, and Jesus' response is, hey, don't you know that this is my calling? I am called to serve the Lord in his house. And his parents say, no, you're going home with us. And so Jesus leaves Jerusalem and returns home with his parents. And then the passage says in Luke 2:52, and Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and in stature and in favor. So he's growing in his capacity to think. He's growing in his relational capacity, and he's physically growing as his brain develops. Yes, that was God's calling. No, he was not adequately prepared. In fact, it would be almost 20 years before God said to him, okay, now it's time, and now you're ready. Do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? I was doing some examination of David's sling. I don't know if you've ever looked into that, but Chronicles actually tells us that there was a cohort of the Israelite army that could sling a rock at a hair's width and never miss. It says there was 700 guys. So this was an art during that day, right? But I actually watched a part of a documentary on this where they measured the ballistics of these ancient slings, and the ballistics are comparative to a .44 Magnum pistol. So this is not the Precious Moments version, of David where he has the little droopy rubber slingshot. Ping! David had a legitimate skill set that he had been honing and developing that this situation called for. So the first question is, do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? And if the answer is no, I'm not suggesting that it's a bad plan, but I'm suggesting that you might have work to do. I don't know if some of you know this. It was about 8 years ago. I sat down with Dory Hagen. It was 8 years ago? Where's Dory? I just saw her. It was 8 years ago? 7 or 8 years ago? And we were talking about her gifting and calling and what was consistent with her abilities. And really what it came down to is that she wanted to be able to provide quality, credentialed counseling to the community of Homer from a godly perspective. I said, that's an amazing calling. You realize that you're a long ways from that. And she said, yep, I realize. And so she went to school. This is 7, 8 years ago, and just last week received her license as a Christian counselor, which is a huge deal, right? Do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? And if I do not currently possess them, am I willing to go after them? Am I willing to pursue that development and pay a price in order to gain the skills that God's calling will require of me? What I have found in dealing with young people in particular is that laziness in preparation is constantly disguised with a faith claim. In other words, I'm just trusting the Lord. And I'm going to get to the faith piece because faith is required. But faith does not operate in the absence of God's calling on your life to develop your own skills and abilities, your own character, your own faith, and to mature in that. So the first question is, do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? This is something that I ask young people all the time. Do you have the skills currently to do the thing that God has called you to do? And if not, what are you going to do about that? So Saul hands David his armor, says, "Here, put this on." And David says, I can't even walk in this stuff. I'm going to fight the way that I have been trained to fight, and that is with a sling. And so David takes his sling and goes down to approach the Philistine. It says in 1 Samuel 17, picking it up in verse 43, and the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." And then David said to the Philistine, "You come at me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. And this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all of the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all his assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it into our hands." That is one cocky kid. You know what I mean? And this is the tension of the story. So is it David's ability, or is it total reliance on the Lord and his power? David seems to have no issue sort of resting his confidence in both places. He says, no, I have a skill set. And yet David also recognizes that his end game is not Goliath's defeat. His end game is the defeat of the army, right? The Philistine army that's coming against them. He says, okay, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to take you down. I know how to do that. And yet that is going to be entirely insufficient. God's goal is your total defeat. And that's what God's going to accomplish. There's this tension between developing my own capacities, my own abilities, my own skill, and yet recognizing that at the end of my own development, my capacities are entirely insufficient to fully accomplish everything that God has called me to. So here's the second question. Is my faith in God's commands and his promises? This is another piece that I see often missing when I'm giving counsel to, again, particularly young people with big, audacious plans. Is your faith resting in things that God has actually promised? God has not promised you wild success, riches, prosperity, and health. If that was the case, then we have some explaining to do as to why all of the disciples, save John, were wiped out in the first generation of the church, suffered under great duress, and were eventually killed, murdered for their calling. So then the question becomes, what does God promise that I can rest on? David knew that God had promised the defeat of these armies. And so he looks at this situation and says, I don't understand what's going on here. Didn't God say that he would do this on our behalf? All we have to do is walk in his commands and then cling to his promises. And so he steps out in obedient faith. From the very beginning in the garden, it was always God's plan that mankind, that you and I would take dominion over the earth, that we would establish the authority of God on the earth. This is one of, I think, the challenging areas of faith as we mature, is the relationship between our dependence upon the power of God and yet God's call in our life to take ownership. He says, no, I've made promises. I've made promises consistent with what I've enabled you to do. So David has a certain skill set, and he says, yet, and even after what I have to bring to the table, at the end of that, I entirely expect God to fulfill his promises. This is the same with the Great Commission. You know, when Jesus, you've heard me talk about this before, when Jesus rose up into the heavens as he's departing, he says, I want you to go and make disciples, right? He says, lo, my spirit will be with you. He will empower you to go and make disciples. Jesus was not departing because he was incapable of making disciples. He says, no, I've left that calling for you. Go and make disciples. And yet, know this, my spirit will enable you in what you lack. Does that mean that we should make no effort to grow in our capacities, to develop our skills, to develop our confidence? Absolutely not. He's called us to make disciples, and yet makes up for what we do lack through the power of his Spirit to give us success as we grow. David knew the promises of God. You know, we're coming up on our 10th anniversary at Church on the Rock, which seems almost unbelievable. But I remember sitting with Jonathan Walker and saying to Jonathan Walker, John, I know that God right now has called me to do this, and I know that he will be faithful to us. I have no idea whether this is going to work. God hasn't promised the success of church plants. And church plants fail all of the time, right? What can I stand on? Obedience to what God has called me to do here, now. I'm going to be obedient to that. And I'm holding to the promise that he will not abandon me. But I can't say that God has promised me the success that I envision in my mind. But I'm entrusting that to him. And I'm putting myself on the line. So David says, I have a skill set, but really it's God that's going to do this, and walks to the battle line. Here's the third question. Just review real quick. So the first question, do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? And if not, how will I develop them? Secondly, is my faith in God's commands and his promises? Is my confidence in things that he has actually promised to me? Thirdly, who does my plan put at risk? Wow, that's a really crazy idea. That's a pretty outlandish plan that you have. Seems risky. You seem to have a sense that God's called you to step out in faith and do this thing. Who does your plan put at risk? Again, what I have found is that oftentimes when people are about to step out in obedience and say, okay, this is the thing that God has called me to, they immediately begin reaching out to find other people who will assume the risk. David says, God's given me a certain skill set. I'm standing on his promises. I'm willing to bear the risk of that entirely on my own shoulders. And he walks to the battle line. The confidence there is just stunning. I'm not asking anyone. I'm not resting God's calling on my life and my obedience. I'm not resting that on anyone else's shoulders. Well, if they would have done this, then I could have walked in obedience. If they had provided this, if they had funded this, then I could have fully obeyed. David says, no. I have God's promises. I've developed my skills. I'm going to step out there, and if I step out alone, I step out alone. I think this is why David and Jonathan were such good friends. Because remember just a couple of chapters ago, Jonathan turns to his shield bearer and says, we have the promises of God. What are we doing? Let's go. And the shield bearer says, hey, I'm with you. Let's do this together. And the two of them walk up and bring about this great defeat. And it says that when David and Jonathan met, their hearts were immediately knit. These were guys whose confidence in the promises of God had led them to, in really unique ways, entirely put themselves on the line in confidence to those promises. It says their hearts were knit together. And it happened. The Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, and David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag, took from it a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his head so that he fell on his face to the ground. David owned his faith decision such that he did not put the burden of obedience on anyone other than himself. God has called me to this. I'm going to own it. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that we never reach out for partners in God's calling, right? Jonathan says to his shield bearer, "You're coming with?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm coming with you." And he says, "All right, let's do this together." Absolutely. But what I have found over and over is that when people are walking in true faith on the promises of God, it produces a confidence in them such that they're not resting their obedience, they're not resting their faithfulness on anyone else. I'm walking into this battle. Do you want to come with me? Not, I would go, but I need him or her or them to do something, and until they do, well, clearly, I just can't do this. David puts his own life on the line, takes that decision of risk. I'm aware of this all of the time as a husband, and I think husbands need to be sensitive to this fact, is that I know as a typical gender stereotype, and you can criticize me for this, but it seems to be true, that men are more prone to risk-taking than women are, particularly when it comes to money. Who are you asking to assume the risk? I'm very aware of the fact that when I take risks, it's not just me that's taking it. It's my wife and my family, right? God calls me to own that, to take responsibility for that. David owns it. He says, I'm taking this risk. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up. So 3 questions. Again, this is not a formula, but it is some things to consider as you are trying to navigate a risky, a big, a dangerous faith decision to step out. Do I possess the qualities that my plan requires? And if not, how am I developing those? Is my faith in God's commands and his promises? Am I searching the word to understand what it is that I can rely on, what it is that I can trust? And then thirdly, who does my plan put at risk? And is my faith such that I am willing to gladly own that risk as I step out in obedience? Some of you in your own lives have been disillusioned because you thought that you were called to step out and do something and it did not go well. And what I have found over and over, and I'm with you on that, I have stepped out in faith, in obedience, and it did not go like I thought it was going to go. And yet what I've seen over and over is that oftentimes people learn the wrong lessons from that. The lesson is not, don't walk in faith. The lesson is to come back to better understand the promises of God, to better understand who he has created me to be, to better understand his calling in my life, and then take a risk again. Some of you have marched out to the battle line and slung a stone that just slammed into your own foot. And the only reason your foot isn't mangled is because you were never very good at slinging stones. And what happens is people walk away from those and say, I guess I just don't take risks anymore. No, the Christian life, as the scriptures describe, is full of great risks. It's laying our lives on the line. It's denying myself, taking up my cross and following Jesus. James 2:26. Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith that does not lead to action is dead. That our faith, our reliance, our dependence upon God calls us to take risks. It calls us to take relational risks. It calls us to take career risks, calling risks. I've been surrounded by testimonies of people who have taken great risks and seen God come through. My hope is that you'll be able to take those risks with some confidence to evaluate those plans as you move forward. But God will be with you. Would you stand? God, I'm so thankful that in the context of relationship with you and in your kingdom, that there is grace. There is grace to step out. There is grace to fail. There is grace to get it wrong and to recommit ourselves to getting it right as we follow you. Pray that our confidence would come from a deep understanding of your will, your intentions, your promises, your commands, and a deep-rooted commitment at all cost to step out in obedience to you, no matter what we face. That confidence would give us the capacity to entrust the outcome and the victory to you. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to end a little early. The kids are going until just before noon. So if you have children, don't forget that you have children. They're up in the other building. But you can hang out here for a few minutes, let them wrap up, and then pick them up on your way. If you're interested in baptism today, now's the time to take that step of obedience. Skip would love to meet with you up here right now and talk with you about that. At 2 o'clock, we'll be out at the Ingebretson Homestead. Bring a side dish to share. If you've not been out there with your children, it's a fantastic place to bring your kids. So we'll see you at 2 o'clock. God bless you. God keep you in your walk of faith. You are dismissed.